What did Jesus look like? Was he handsome? Was he homely? And should we even be asking this question? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Kosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing with our 10th lesson in the book of Isaiah. We've come to a really rich passage associated with the church with Jesus for centuries. And to help me with this passage, I've invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Dybdahl, to help us kind of get the sense of what this section of Isaiah is all about. So Dr. Dybdahl, welcome to Theology Sabbath School, and let's go ahead and get started by, maybe you could explain to us, I've indicated that this section of Isaiah is really important. Can you kind of explain what this section is and what makes it so significant?
Yeah, so this is a section of Isaiah that, were we to read through it, those that are even just a little bit familiar with the Bible would probably recognize phrases. There would be things that would be familiar. We could read other places in Isaiah, other places in the Old Testament, where we wouldn't have that same degree of familiarity. And one of the reasons why this would be so familiar to us is that we don't just find these phrases in Isaiah, in these chapters, chapters 50 to 53 of Isaiah, but this passage, this section from Isaiah is, at least according to some sources, is the most quoted or alluded to portion of the Old Testament in the New Testament. So we read this in Isaiah, but we will read phrases, we'll read sections of this portion of Isaiah in the New Testament frequently. So it's familiar and it's significant.
So what is it about these chapters that then make them so significant?
Well, this is a portion of Isaiah where there are passages that are called suffering servant passages. Passages, as the title would suggest, that describe a servant that is faithful, at least is called to be faithful to God, and it describes the experience of this servant. And again, as the title suggests, it's not all happy, it's not all easy, but there is quite a lot of suffering that is involved.
Yeah, I know we'll get to more specific aspects of this whole section, but I guess you said it's about this servant, the servant of the Lord, who you've identified in this section as the suffering servant. So who is this suffering servant? And I know when I asked that question, it's really not a new question. I think back to the book of Acts chapter 8, and the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. And as you know the story very well, as Philip is walking, he sees this carriage coming, and he hears the scripture being read out loud, and it's Isaiah, this section. And it's this very same question that I'm asking you that the eunuch asked Philip 2,000 years ago. Who is this about? Is it about Isaiah or is it about someone else?
Yeah, so the question of the eunuch is one that has been, as you just said, has echoed down through history. I remember it was seminary. I was taking a class. I don't remember exactly the name of the class even. I don't know that it was just on Isaiah. But we spent a long time on these servant passages in Isaiah, and I realized as the teacher was seemed like they were building a case, and they were, I came to realize that there's actually a lot of debate about who precisely is being referred to in these passages. So we're not going to go for days and days, obviously, as we did in that class. But a very quick generalized overview here is that I think clearly in the passages in Isaiah, there are like sort of waves of descriptions of this servant, not just here in these chapters, but even earlier we'll read about this servant. And in the adult lesson study guide that we're basing these lessons on, they mention that it's like kind of like a work of art where the artist, little by little, puts something on the canvas. And as we pick up these pieces, as we work our way through Isaiah, the picture of the suffering servant is varied, but in a certain sense also becomes clearer, I think, as we go. So, back to the question, who is the suffering servant? In some places in the past, in Isaiah, explicitly, this servant refers to Israel. The text will just say that flat out. So, God has called Israel. They're to be faithful to Him. They're to obey Him. And God intends to work through them on behalf of the world. So we might say, well, the suffering servant is Israel. However, it's also clear in Isaiah that Israel is not the faithful servant that God called them to be. So Israel fails. And as we continue to read, we come across passages that talk about this servant that God has called, that this servant actually has a mission to Israel. So the servant is Israel, and then in other passages there's a differentiation here between the faithful servant, the obedient servant, who has a mission, as I said, to Israel. And this anonymous servant, as we continue to read, working our way through Isaiah, this anonymous servant, the descriptions of this anonymous servant become more and more and more clearly associated with or descriptive of the life and the ministry and the death of Jesus. So I would be one who would see this sort of varied description of the servant. Yes, sometimes Israel, but then quite clearly, for me at least, quite clearly referring to Jesus. And that's what the New Testament does. So I'm in good company. It's not like I'm going out on a limb here to say this with some, heretical suggestion. But the New Testament uses these suffering servant songs in the same way, applies them quite directly and quite clearly to Jesus.
Well, you answered the question just like Philip answered the question of the eunuch. And it is really an interesting passage. But what strikes me is that even though we can focus here, and I'll ask you in a second to kind of give us some more details about this servant in Isaiah 50 through 53. But if we look back and think of what we've looked at this entire quarter, as we've looked at the book of Isaiah, we've seen actually other indications. And at first it starts off with chapters 7 and 9 and 11 with, unto you a child is born, and the description of this child who's to come. And we follow that throughout the book of Isaiah. And we have other references in chapter 47, verse 1 and down, where it talks about the suffering servant and his nature and, a bruised reed he would not crush. And Christians, as they've looked throughout the book of Isaiah, you can kind of see here aspects of, I think, prophetically, the entire life of Christ, the child who's God with us, aspects of his ministry. And now here to these chapters, references, I think, to the last part of Christ's ministry during his time here on earth. And maybe you can kind of make it clearer what aspects we see, how this suffering servant is described in these chapters in Isaiah here.
Yeah, so I won't read through the whole all the passages here, but just to highlight a few things, and then Carl, maybe there's something that you would want to highlight that I have skipped over here. But as we read, I am going to read just a little bit here. So from Isaiah, just chapter 50, just a couple of verses here. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. And then jumping over to Isaiah 53, He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. It says, surely he took up our infirmities, he carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And I'm guessing that these are, at least many of these are familiar phrases. I referred to that right at the start of our time together. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before her shears is silent. So he did not open his mouth. And this is like, it's heavy and it's emotional and sad. And yet we also find in these passages hope. And I realize you asked a question. I'm not really listing things yet. I guess I'll do that in just a moment. But we find in verse 10 of Isaiah 53 that this suffering, this taking on our punishment, being pierced for our transgressions, that this was actually God's will that this would be done, which is almost mind-boggling, and yet we know that in Christ this is indeed what happened. There's a clear fulfillment. And then verse 11 of Isaiah 53, after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. So there's like this turn where we have the hope and a kind of prophecy, if you please, of life that will return to this suffering and faithful servant. And again, in the life of Jesus, we have that taking place, of course, with the resurrection. So I'll mention a few things that stand out to me, like descriptors, if you please. What do we learn about Jesus based on these passages? And the first thing that I'll mention is actually connected to your lead-in question, Carl. And that was about the appearance of Jesus. Was he handsome? Was he homely? I think we struggle, actually, when faced with questions like this, because it seems to me that we are so used to talking about Jesus in his divinity that questions, when we press questions about his humanity, we start to become uncomfortable just a bit. I think during the course of his life, people struggled. People saw Jesus as human. They struggled to see him as divine. For us, it's the other way around. I think it's easier for us to think of Jesus as a divine being and more difficult for us to really accept him as fully human. So that's where like the physical description is maybe awkward for some of us. But I think it is significant, this statement, that there was nothing in his appearance that would attract us to him. Then there's the phrase, like a root out of dry ground, which again is not, most of us would not think of that as a beautiful and attractive image. I'd contrast what Isaiah says about Jesus with a little assignment that I have given to students actually over a number of years in a class that I used to teach. And it just simply asked students to imagine that Jesus meets you, comes to meet you in your dorm room or wherever you are, comes to meet you tonight. And I asked them to describe how they imagine Jesus would look. And of course, no one describes Jesus in exactly the same way. But there was a recurring pattern where people would talk about Jesus. He was generally tall. He was good looking. I remember people describing, at least someone describing him as kind of a surfer sort of appearance, tanned and muscular. These were the kinds of descriptions, and just that he was attractive to look at. They wouldn't come right out and say it, but this was kind of the idea that was dominant, and I think maybe is dominant for us. It's hard for us to imagine Jesus as unlovely physically, and I guess I've talked about this for a while. I'm gonna press it just a bit here. I've seen on a number of occasions artistic, supposedly scientific, artistic renderings of what Jesus might have looked like, and they're supposedly based on, excavations and what we know about first century Jews in Palestine, and how, average height, and did they wear beards, and was their hair curly or straight, and so on. And I've seen these renditions of Jesus, supposedly scientific, and usually I've been kind of bothered by them because it didn't match the image of Jesus that I had in my mind. And a number of them that I've seen, Jesus physically he wouldn't have appeared on a magazine cover today. What if this is correct, that there wasn't anything in him physically that would attract us to him? What if there were elements of his appearance that we might even pull back from? And again, I think the text suggests that this might have been the case, or that this was the case. I think it's worthwhile, and if you're waiting after this long reflection here, if you're waiting for there to be a clear point, so we know from this, that's not going to come. But I think there's value in reflecting on this question. And what was it? What was it that was attractive about Jesus? If there was nothing about his appearance, what was it that would draw people to him? And I think there's value in that sort of reflection. So I spent a long time on that. The text says that about Jesus, nothing in his appearance. Clearly he was despised.
So it's interesting you talked about, the appearance of Jesus, and it reminds me of two stories that really amplify, I think, your point. So, I often go to Israel. I lead many tours in Israel, and I have a favorite bus driver I work with. And we talked about Jesus several times, and he always says that Jesus we get wrong. He says because Jesus would have blonde hair. And I'm like, I've never seen a picture of Jesus with blonde hair. But my bus driver is an Arab, and for him, thinking of Jesus is that, commanding individual, and who's going to stand out. And for him, in the Arab world, everyone has black, dark hair. And so he envisions Jesus on a white horse with long, flowing blonde hair. And then the second story that made me think of when you mentioned these physical descriptions is that in a couple of weeks, we have a series coming out called Reliving Mark on the Hope Channel. And it focuses on Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And I tell in one of the backstories about that series our challenge in finding a Jesus character, because we struggled with the very issue you're talking about, is finding someone who would represent Jesus. And even though this passage brings out these points, for the viewer, the idea is that Jesus has to be a compelling individual. And if he doesn't quite fit, if he's too short or too big, or his beard is not quite right, that we tend to say, well, that couldn't be Jesus. Because we have this idea that it's the visual element of him that was compelling and inviting. And certainly I don't want to say Jesus was, you couldn't look at him because he was so offensive looking. But I think really what drew people to him was his character and his deeds, and not simply his appearance. So if you're interested in seeing about that, you can go to relivingmark.com, and behind the scenes stories, we have one episode that's dedicated entirely to this very issue we're talking about, how Jesus is represented and what it was that compelled people really to follow him. So this passages here are always fascinating to me because it challenges me to think about what is it about Jesus that should draw me to him.
Yeah, and there are other people in the Bible that we know some information. I mean, there's not maybe detailed, but we find out something about some people. David is introduced, as a young man. It says he has a ruddy complexion. He was handsome. We know things about various people in Scripture, but about Jesus, at least in the New Testament, the Gospels do not provide us with a physical description of him. Just looking down here at my list of other things that we could mention, what do we learn about Jesus? I mentioned he was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. I like a move that I've sensed in the last, I don't know what few years means now based on my lifespan, but in the last decade or so, I think there's been a move away from just the somber and sorrowful Jesus. And that's good. I like that. I think Jesus laughed. I think Jesus smiled. Children were attracted to him. He felt comfortable at wedding celebrations, apparently. So I think there's that element of Jesus. But this is also important, I think, to remind ourselves of. Jesus did not have an easy life by any stretch. And as we go through sorrow, as we go through grief, we have a Savior who understands that in deep kinds of ways. And very importantly here in these passages, we also discover that the servant suffers on our behalf, taking our transgression, our iniquity, our sin upon himself, and suffers even unto death. So this, again, I think clearly is a reference, a kind of prophecy even, we could say, referring to what Jesus does with his laying down of his life. And then that it was God's will, that God is working through all of this. It's not an accident of history, but it's part of God's overall plan for redemption for the world. And then that it's turned into victory. So I like this. I think sometimes we spend so much time on the sufferings of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. We may not remind ourselves as often as we ought that Jesus is alive and that his sacrifice on our behalf, that's not the end of the story, but that Jesus is raised to life again and is interceding for us in heaven. So these are some of the features that we see, and more could be mentioned. Carl, I don't know if there's something that for you that you would want to add, but those are a few things that I had here in my notes.
I think those are great points. I would just add two things and a little bit of an expansion. You mentioned this aspect of the suffering and that being God's will. I think there's an interesting connection if we look back. We looked at this passage a few weeks ago, but Isaiah chapter 40, and this is the passage that starts off about comfort my people. And a beautiful passage. But early on in verse 2, he says, speak tenderly to Jerusalem, cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned. And scholars point out that there's no really explanation in Isaiah 40 about the basis on which Israel's iniquity has been pardoned. But the answer doesn't come in chapter 40, but it seems to come here in chapter 53, which is the suffering servant who becomes the substitute for Israel and lays down his life. And the other point I would note is that you mentioned this verse earlier in Isaiah 53, and that's verse 11, where it says, out of the anguish of his soul he shall see. And your version actually went on a little bit more to say he shall see light. In fact, it's interesting. If you have a study Bible and you look in the notes, you'll often see that the Masoretic text is the one that says he shall just see light. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are our oldest copies, 1,000 years earlier than the Masoretic text, the Hebrew copies from about 1,000 years ago or so. But the copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually have a little expansion here, and there's a debate on which one's original, but it says that he shall see light. And many see that here as an element that points to the light that Christ saw as he left the tomb, and perhaps a prophetic reference, an allusion, an indication of the resurrection, of life from the dead, as he would once again see light after his suffering. So these passages are rich. They've been a source of fascination and study, and as you said, it's quoted often in the New Testament, and all of them trying to nurse out these ideas and points here this passage is just so pregnant, so rich, full of, that we could spend a lot of time talking about it. But I know our time is quickly running, but I'm just curious, Paul, is there any favorite passages here for you? Anything that you've already mentioned several, but anything that jumps out, perhaps maybe even not on the point of Jesus, but other things here in this passage that may catch your attention?
Yeah, of course, lots of things that we could reflect on. I was struck in preparing for this, just thinking of what Jesus did for us, and the fact that even as he is offering himself on our behalf, that we as human beings considered him stricken and afflicted by God, and essentially we're blind to what he's doing, and so he is suffering. He's suffering alone, and that's something. I mean, we sense that as human beings. Like, suffering is terrible. All suffering is terrible, but to suffer alone, to be misunderstood, to have no other human that can walk with us, that understands. It's a painful kind of picture. And I wasn't sure that I was going to mention this, but a very short little snippet of my life. I remember it was when I was pastoring in the Oregon Conference. I guess that doesn't really matter, but I was driving in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and school had just gotten out. The bus had stopped, and young students are piling out onto the street, had done that just a few moments ago. And then they're walking down the street. And there are little bunches of happy children laughing and playing and all of that as they're kind of walking to their homes. And it was obvious in the moment when you looked at this scene, you could see who was alone. They were trailing at the back. There was no one around them. Their head was down. And I just remember in that moment, it's like vivid in my mind, just, your heart just goes out to that little child. I don't know all the situation, but like they're alone. They're alone. They probably were through most of the day, and they probably will walk home the same way tomorrow. They won't be included in those groups. And to think of Jesus as the one who, walked the lonesome valley, misunderstood, is for me a poignant and painful and moving picture.
Yeah, that is, as you think about the path that Jesus chose to walk, and we see that in the Gospels, and we see it all rooted here. Clearly, Jesus saw himself as that suffering servant who was willing to walk alone so we don't have to walk alone. Often, and well, not often, always, we talk about how passages like these what lessons they might have for us in our current world. And we've talked a lot about, aspects pointing to Jesus, but is there really, what would be the take home? Is there any lesson for us for today in 2021?
Sure, and many potential lessons. One thing that spoke to me was actually kind of triggered by the passage that I read earlier from Isaiah chapter 50 about offering my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. And it seems to me like today, how can I say this? And I want to be careful. It seems like today we easily take offense. We're quick to defend ourselves. If someone does not treat us the way we ought to be treated, we're sort of trained, I think, to let them know, right? To stand up for ourselves, to not take it, retaliate in some sort of way, call them out. And this idea of accepting mocking and ridicule and undeserved, and taking it, even silently, is something that is challenging for me, and I'm not exactly sure how to apply it in my life, but I have a pretty good sense that if I'm secure in my place in God's family, then I can probably be a little less touchy, a little less sensitive if others, say or do something that I think isn't quite treating me the way I ought to be treated. The challenge here is that Jesus also stood up against injustice, right? So it's not that we ignore cruelty, and that's maybe why this passage is challenging to me. But I know that I could be less touchy. Can I just say it that way? And more willing to trust that God will work, maybe through my example, maybe even through my suffering, rather than feeling the need to continually lash out at others who don't treat me the way I think I deserve to be treated.
Paul, that may have been a little too relevant. And I say that jokingly, of course, but that, I think we could really end there, and that would be, if anything, a take-home message for us in this passage. That certainly speaks to our situation today in a very clear and strong way. But I don't want to end just yet. We just have a few more minutes. And you and I talked before we went on air with this. We talked about the prophetic nature of these passages. But you also indicated that there was something about the genre of these chapters in Isaiah that you wanted to point out. And what exactly was that?
Yeah, and it seems like it's something that was lost in that discussion with the professor at seminary as we're going through the arguments about who exactly is the suffering servant, and is it this or that or whatever. It's like we were approaching it scientifically, it seemed like, and science is terrific. But the thing that I would note here, and that I'd like to highlight, at least in conclusion for me, is that while this is, we can think of it as prophecy, it's poetry. It's poetry. And that means something. Now, it's unfortunate that most of us, myself included, are not so familiar with ancient Hebrew that I can read it in the original language and really appreciate it as poetry. Poetry doesn't translate so well. So as we read, I think it's valuable to remind ourselves that in its original language, as people would have heard that, it would have been emotionally moving. It wasn't just sort of formulaic, like, well, here's a characteristic and here's another characteristic of the servant, but it would have touched them. It would have moved them. And one of the reasons I was thinking about this was that for Christmas, one of the gifts my wife and I received from one of our children was a used book of poetry, and I'm holding it in my hand, Poems That Touch the Heart. It's a collection of poems. And I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but this is the way we received it. Not with these, but with all these little marks. And our child, the child that gave this to us, said, here are some of the poems that were especially meaningful to me. And I was reading these, at least some of them, this last week, and I found myself moved to tears. It's English, and it's poetry that kind of connects with me in deeper ways. And I just thought, what is lost as we're reading from Isaiah in the English translation, the kind of emotional impact that we're missing. And what I thought I might do is actually conclude by reading a poem. And it doesn't have to move you emotionally. I know for some people, poetry is just not really so great. It's a short little poem, and I think it connects actually with what we discussed. But I'm not going to try to make the connection at the end, read the poem and then, well, here's what it means. I'm going to simply let it be. And I say poem. Do I have 3 minutes, Carl? Because if I do, I could read 2 poems.
We'll give you 3 minutes.
3 minutes. I'll start here. This is author unknown. The title, Tribute on the Passing of a Very Real Person. And again, I think both of these poems connect with what we've talked about. I'm going to try really hard not to, the preacher part, like, well, I want to make sure they get the lesson, and I'm going to refrain from that. Here we go. People are of 2 kinds, and he was the kind I'd like to be. Some preach their virtues, and a few express their lives by what they do. That sort was he. No flowery phrase or glibly spoken word of praise won friends for him. He wasn't cheap or shallow, but his course ran deep, and it was pure. You know the kind. Not many in life you find whose deeds outrun their words so far that more than what they seem, they are. And then I'll close with a prayer. Both these poems, again, were marked by our child, so that is partly what makes them so meaningful. A prayer. Let me do my work each day, and if the darkened hours of anxiety overcome me, may I not forget the strength that comforted me in the desolation of other times. May I still remember the bright hours that found me walking over the silent hills of earlier days or dreaming on the margin of the quiet river. When I vowed to have courage amid the tempests of the changing years. Spare me from bitterness and from the sharp passions of unguarded moments. May I not forget that poverty and true riches are of the Spirit. Though the world know me not, may my thoughts and actions be such as shall keep me friendly with myself. Give me a few friends who will love me for what I am, and keep ever burning before my vagrant steps the kindly light of hope. And though age and infirmity overtake me, and I come not within sight of the castle of my dreams, teach me still to be thankful for life and for time's olden memories that are good and sweet. And may the evening's twilight find me gentle still. That's by Max Ehrman, The Prayer.
Dr. Dybdahl, thank you for joining us today for Theology Sabbath School and for those thoughts you've shared on some really important passages. Chance for us to reflect on, I think, what Jesus has done for us, and what he's done for us can then give us the cause to have joy. And may each of us know that joy, no matter what aspect of life's journey we're on together, but we may experience that to the fullest today. Well, thank you for joining us for Theology Sabbath School. I invite you to join us again next week as we look at Isaiah 59 through about chapter 64. Our lesson is entitled The Desire of Nations, and our lead teacher will be Professor Brant Bergelin. So until then, take care, thanks for watching, and God bless.